So today's discussion is the fourth installment of this new podcast series titled Rethinking Contemporary Islamic Movements in and Across Europe and the Middle East. This podcast series is hosted by the Al-Walid Centre in Edinburgh University and the Centre of Islamic Studies in Cambridge University. We also thank the Gerda Henkel Foundation for its financial support. So my name is Dr. Eyre, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Al-Walid Centre in Edinburgh University.
And my name is Dr. Iman Dawood, and I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the Centre of Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge.
So today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Théo Blanc. Théo is a postdoctoral researcher in the ERC-funded research project MENA-PERC. This is Political Elite and Regime Change in the Middle East and North Africa, based at the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Pisa. He's also a visiting fellow at the European University Institute. Théo received a Ph.D. in Social and Political Sciences from the European University Institute in Florence in June 2023, and his thesis addressed the genealogy of Salafi currents in Tunisia and their political trajectories before and after the 2010-2011 revolution in Tunisia. So welcome, Théo.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us, Théo. I think I'd like to get this conversation started. I'd love to learn more about your experiences researching Salafism, particularly in the Tunisian context. Could you perhaps begin by telling us a little bit about what drew you to study Salafism, and especially within the Tunisian context?
Well, I first read about Salafism in my first years at university when writing a thesis on the rise of the so-called Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. And at the time, I was particularly interested in understanding the differences between Salafism, jihadism, Takfirism, all those ideological currents and categories that are often employed by academics and the media alike, but that are not always defined. And it was especially difficult to understand what kind of connection these currents had between one another. So I remember clearly at the time that one of the debates triggered by the rise of ISIS was to what extent ISIS was the ideological product of Saudi Salafism, with some going as far as claiming that Saudi Arabia was, quote unquote, an ISIS that had succeeded. And actually, this wasn't an entirely new debate, but one that reactivated a discussion that had already been prompted by the fact that 15 out of 19 terrorists behind 9/11 were Saudi citizens. Of course, I wasn't satisfied with the equation Saudi Salafism equal ISIS-style jihadism, because that didn't explain why there were attacks by ISIS in Saudi Arabia, or why Turkey had initially been very lenient, not to say complicit, with ISIS activities in Syria, despite not sharing any ideological commonalities. And of course, I progressively understood the ideological differences between Salafism and jihadism, and especially when it comes to proclaiming jihad, using violence, the conditions to exterminate Muslims, and the relationship with the ruler, among other points. The second turning point, perhaps, that led to my PhD research was a book by Stéphane Lacroix entitled Awakening Islam, in which Lacroix provides a fascinating political sociology of Islamism and Salafism in Saudi Arabia. And that book contributed greatly to my understanding of this phenomenon. One of the most salient issues, perhaps from my perspective, was the emergence of a political current of Salafism. Unlike Lacroix, who was perhaps among the first academics to identify this current, many analysts couldn't really make sense of this development, because Salafism had almost always been a quietist phenomenon that did not engage in politics and that was content to simply obey the ruler, or to stay aloof from politics. Of course, the Arab revolutions were a major watershed moment for the entire region, and therefore for Salafism too. In many countries such as Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, and others, we started seeing Salafi groups and individuals increasingly participating in the public sphere, as well as in formal politics. And perhaps one of the most striking cases was the case of Tunisia. And that is because Tunisia underwent an unprecedented democratic transition, and that is in contrast with other countries that also witnessed uprisings. For example, Morocco, where the liberalization of the electoral game was ultimately controlled and limited by the monarchy. There's also the case of Egypt, where democratization lasted for less than 2 years and was eventually subverted by Marshal al-Sisi in the summer of 2013. And of course, Tunisia also stands in contrast with other countries such as Syria, Yemen, and Libya that descended into civil wars. So in this regional context, Tunisia really emerged as a real-life laboratory to explore the relationship between Salafism and a nascent democracy. And that was the main reason I chose to study Tunisia.
Thank you so much, Théo. I mean, honestly, the relationship between Salafism and politics is certainly fascinating. And I can only imagine that within Tunisia during this time, it was a very exciting research project. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your main findings, especially, about the main Salafi currents that emerged within Tunisia after the uprisings, for example, or before and after, maybe a little bit of a comparison between how the context has changed after the 2011 uprisings.
Well, first of all, I think it is important not to exaggerate the role of the Arab revolutions in the rise of Salafism. From my perspective, the Arab revolutions have had an unveiling effect as opposed to a productive effect on Salafism. And that is in contrast with analysis of a so-called democratic paradox, which circulates especially among neoconservative circles, whereby democratization was said to lead to the empowerment of various Islamic activists. But in reality, Salafism is not the product of democratization per se, but rather the product of decades of brutal authoritarian rule and marginalization of traditional religious references and movements, and as a consequence, the quest for alternative religiosities to the official state Islam. So in that sense, the Arab revolutions revealed a phenomenon that had silently spread in Tunisia as well as in other countries. So, for example, the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia had tolerated and even sometimes facilitated the rise of Salafism against what it saw as its main enemy, namely political Islam. And that is because Salafism was reluctant to oppose the authorities, as I mentioned earlier, and was also critical of political Islam. So Salafism was very much an objective ally in the regime's struggle with the Islamists, which constituted the main opposition. But with the rise of violent Salafi jihadi activities in the early 2000s in Tunisia, such as the 2003 attack and 2007 Suleiman clashes, the Tunisian regime had been clamping down on Salafism as a whole in the decade leading to the revolution. The Salafi currents we see emerging after the revolution in Tunisia are more or less in line with the three traditional categories that we know, namely a quietist or purist Salafism that is mostly concerned with preaching, religious education, and the purification of the creed, a political Salafism that leans towards engagement in formal politics and top-down reform, and finally, a jihadi type of Salafism that believes in the impiety of rulers and the necessity to wage violent jihad. So those three currents initially benefited from the liberalization of the public sphere in Tunisia, as well as the dismantling of the political police and the amnesty of thousands of political prisoners, including terrorism convicts. But it is also important to acknowledge that these three currents underwent major changes after 2011. The quietist Salafis increasingly engaged in associative activism, Before the revolution, Salafis controlled some mosques and had some private schools that were more or less tolerated by the regime, but they did not voice demands in the public sphere, not to mention the political sphere. And they generally refrained from taking a political position, or even sometimes called to support the ruler, which is, of course, a political position in and of itself. What was new after the revolution, therefore, was the rise of a quietist Salafi movement that campaigned for the Islamization of the country through associations and marches. The political Salafis, on the other hand, appeared to many as a product of the revolution, as given that many analysts believed that Salafism was apolitical or even anti-political. But one of the findings of my PhD research is that those Salafis that decided to engage in formal politics after 2011 were actually already politicized before the revolution, but they were actually refraining from participating for contextual reasons, as opposed to ideological reasons, such as the fear of repression and the belief that elections were manipulated. So what happens after 2011 in Tunisia is the affirmation of political Salafis that were already politicized, but that now, of course, benefited from a liberalized political scene. And the last current, the Jihadi Salafi current, in Tunisia was very interesting because it embodied a distinct experience within jihadism, and one that echoes the experience of Al-Qaeda in Yemen and Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, namely a group that, after the revolution, decided to shed violence as a systematic instrument of change, and that structured itself as a loose social movement providing social services to the population. So in that sense, the Salafi jihadi current in Tunisia differed from the classical jihadi group resorting to terrorism. Hence the slogan of the Salafi jihadi movement, Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, that, quote unquote, Tunisia is a land of preaching and not of jihad. But of course, at the same time, Ansar al-Sharia supported jihad in Syria and Libya, and even sent fighters to these conflict zones.
Fantastic. This is really, really interesting. Perhaps we could push you a bit further and ask you, in light of what you've said, to what extent then do you think that the different trajectories of these different Salafi currents that you've outlined for us in Tunisia, both before but also after 2010, 2011, are unique to the Tunisian context? And to what extent would you say that they kind of constitute part of a larger, broader transformation occurring in transnational Salafism in the region and perhaps beyond?
Well, it's tempting to consider Tunisia, as some did, as an exceptional case. But from my perspective, Tunisia is not an isolated or exceptional case, but is rather an exemplary case of what is likely to happen when a Muslim majority country democratizes. So I think Tunisia has actually been pioneering a lot of the trends we see in the Arab world. So if we look at Morocco, for example, the politicization of quietist Salafis in the years of political liberalization after the revolution was hampered by the return of regime restrictions on political participation. Had that liberalization continued, we could well have seen the emergence of a full-fledged political Salafi current, as we did in Tunisia. In Yemen and Libya, the civil war also dashed the hopes of Salafis who had created political parties right after the revolution, but who fell victim to the violence. And in Algeria, Jordan, and other authoritarian contexts, we see attempts by political Salafis to enter politics, but they are again blocked by the regime. So in that context, as I said, Tunisia has been a wonderful laboratory to observe the adaptation of Salafis to democratic politics. and has provided insights into what is likely to happen with democratization. And the key, in my opinion, is applying political science research methods to bridge the gap between countries, but also to bridge the gap with an object of study that may appear as exceptional, but is primarily a contextual product that can be studied and compared.
Fantastic. I mean, as you know, Iman and I also conduct research on Salafism in different contexts. And so we'd be very interested in understanding from you, how we can go about conceptualizing some of these recent changes in Salafism, in particular, the groups that you study in Tunisia. So could you tell us a little bit more about the concept of post-Salafism and what it means to you?
Well, the idea of behind the concept of post-Salafism that Professor Olivier Roy and I did not create, but have tried to define in a systematic way, is that Salafis have increasingly been realizing the inadequacy of the fundamentalist and globalized form of Islam to their particular locale. So in a variety of cases, from the Middle East to North Africa, Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, we observe a similar evolution of Salafism from a globalized, decultured religiosity towards a more localized and compromising religiosity. So we already knew the concept of post-Islamism, which essentially meant abandoning the objective of establishing an Islamic state, implementing Sharia law. We also knew the concept of post-jihadism that meant shedding violence. And here the way we define post-Salafism is in terms of a revision of exclusivist and isolationist tendencies, alongside a reinvention of Salafis' modes of engagement with society at the religious, political, and cultural levels. So we see this transformation taking place at three levels. First, indigenization, which means increasing embeddedness in local dynamics. Second, politicization. And thirdly, reculturation, which often encompasses greater tolerance towards other Islamic groups, Islamic jurisprudence, and local culture. And it is also important to emphasize the fact that in the prefix post in post-Salafism does not mean exit. But like Asef Bayat in the case of post-Islamism, we use it to signify a qualitative shift and a project by actors to reinvent themselves. So in other words, we do not argue that Salafism is disappearing altogether, but that a new current is emerging. So post-Salafism in that sense is not the end of Salafism, but the emergence of a new critical current.
Thank you so much, Théo. Sorry, I got really absorbed with that. Thank you. I think we have to stop here, but those were very, very enlightening reflections. And I just wanted to thank you so much for being with us today on our podcast, Rethinking Contemporary Islamic Movements in and Across Europe and the Middle East. We've really enjoyed hearing about your rich ethnographic fieldwork and about the unique insights into how Salafism has adapted and evolved and will likely continue to evolve and adapt through the years within the Middle Eastern context. We really look forward to hearing more about your work on Salafism in Tunisia, and we look forward to your publications soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.